And we're going to let Megan just, perfect. Greetings. Welcome to the Army Navy Club webinar. Tonight, we're talking about the War for Peace in Vietnam 2025. Um, our author tonight is Ken Saliba, sorry. Um, his first book, Death in the Highlands, The Siege of Special Forces Camp, uh, Play May in 2020, won the 2021 Military Writers Society of America's Gold Medal in History. His work has appeared in the Vietnam magazine On Point, which is the Journal of Army History, and the edited volume book series Indochina. Saliba is an associate professor at Jacksonville University and lives in Florida with his family. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Doug Lucio, retired United States Marine Corps, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken here, I'm sorry, Keith here in just a minute. Once I do so, Keith will have the floor until questions, which we will do at the conclusion of his brief. He will be using slides to present. So, Keith, if you want to take control of the slideshow and pull your slides up, you've got the floor, sir.
Thank you so much. Great to be back with the Army Navy Club. Appreciate you all having me. I have some prepared remarks for this presentation, and then after that, we'll do some a bit of Q&A if anybody's interested. So let me go ahead and get this slide started for you here. All right, are we coming through on that one?
Yes, sir. You've got the full screen going.
Excellent, excellent.
I'm going to go ahead and mute
Oh,
myself. You've got
all
it.
right. Thanks so much. As 1972 dawned, the United States' long, bitter struggle to prevent North Vietnam from conquering the South was at last nearing its end. The war had so far cost more than 57,000 U.S. killed, another 300,000 wounded, over 20 years of American involvement. Vietnamese casualties on both sides were many times that number. Meanwhile, thousands of prisoners of war were held by both sides, including some 600 American POWs. Many hundreds more were listed as missing in action. President Richard Nixon had entered office in 1969 pledging a, quote, honorable peace in Vietnam, one that would allow the United States to withdraw while enabling South Vietnam to stand on its own. To that end, Nixon's policy of Vietnamization was proceeding apace. The plan aimed at transferring responsibility for the war over to South Vietnam by simultaneously withdrawing American forces while training and equipping Saigon's military. U.S. troop strength had plummeted from its peak of nearly 550,000 personnel in 1969 to just over 150,000 by the start of 1972. Only about a third of those could be classified as combat troops, however, and the administration had announced in 1971 that U.S. forces would no longer engage in offensive ground operations. Further, Nixon announced on 13 January that another 70,000 U.S. personnel would be gone by 1 May. Meanwhile, South Vietnam's military had swelled to more than 1 million men under arms, although about half were regional militia and local forces. Saigon also had about 1,000 aircraft and another 1,000 or so naval vessels for the fight against North Vietnam and its southern proxies, the National Liberation Front. The U.S. RVN pacification effort under the Civilian Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, CORDS, had demonstrated real progress as well. Begun in May 1967, its efforts to win the hearts and minds of the rural population, along with the aggressive Phoenix program, which by mid-1972 had led to the death of some 26,000 communist insurgents, the capture of another 33,000, and the defection of about 22,000 more, had seriously alarmed Hanoi. By March 1972, McPhee's Hamlet Evaluation Survey concluded that some 97% of South Vietnam's rural population was living in, quote, totally or relatively secure villages, an unwelcome development for communists north or south. On the diplomatic front, Nixon announced in a nationally televised address on 25 January that beyond the public peace talks begun with North Vietnam in May 1968, his administration had been engaged in secret negotiations with Hanoi since August 1969. This supposedly allowed both sides to discuss and, quote, take positions free from the pressure of public debate. But both public and private talks had yielded very little progress. Nixon said he hoped to break the deadlock by going public about the secret negotiations. The president intimated that the North Vietnamese had not negotiated in good faith, publicly accusing its administration of recalcitrance and bad faith while receiving his many peace overtures in private. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnam's chief negotiator Le Duc Tho had by that January held a dozen covert sessions in Paris. Perhaps the most significant Nixon overture came in his 11 October 1971 private message to Hanoi, in which he presented his, quote, 8 points plan and asked for another secret meeting to discuss. The proposal called for a ceasefire throughout Indochina, the withdrawal of all U.S. and allied forces from South Vietnam within 6 months, and the exchange of all military and civilian prisoners of war. Finally, Nixon's plan called for elections within 6 months to decide the Saigon government's fate. The elections would be open to all political groups in South Vietnam, including members of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG, the shadow organization purportedly governing communist-controlled areas of South Vietnam. Nixon's proposal insisted that political issues be decided only by the people of South Vietnam, with any reunification between North and South accomplished through negotiation and mutual agreement. But North Vietnam was no longer interested in Nixon's peace overtures. After initially agreeing to his request for a secret meeting in November, Hanoi called it off, citing the illness of Le Duc Tho. Communist leaders neither rescheduled the meeting nor responded to Nixon's proposal. Several factors played into the decision. Hanoi, worried over the U.S. president's overtures to its most important patrons, China and the Soviet Union, in an attempt to exploit the ever-widening Sino-Soviet split, most recently punctuated by month-long series of bloody border clashes between the communist giants in March 1969. Nixon set about a policy of rapprochement with China and détente with the Soviet Union. Aside from a welcome lessening of Cold War tensions, Nixon also believed that as each communist nation sought better relations with the United States to strategically balance the other, he could leverage that desire to encourage Peking and Moscow to pressure Hanoi into negotiating peace terms acceptable to the United States. On 15 July 1971, Nixon announced that he would, in February, become the first U.S. president to visit the People's Republic of China. Likewise, he would travel to the Soviet Union for a summit with its leader, Leonid Brezhnev, on 22 May 1972, becoming the first U.S. president to visit the capital city of Moscow. Hanoi feared with some justification that superpower concerns would trump its long-time struggle to reunify the two Vietnams under communist rule. Despite its stubborn independence, North Vietnam's leadership was desperately reliant on the billions of dollars in military, technological, and economic aid provided by its patrons. Facing a possible betrayal by its great power allies, and with the Americans on their way out, Hanoi began to see an all-out win-the-war-now push as its best chance for victory. South Vietnam's botched Operation Lam Son 719 the previous year only added fuel to the fire. An outnumbered and outgunned ARVN force, though backed by American air power and logistical support, had been badly mauled in its effort to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail in southeastern Laos. North Vietnam's powerful General Secretary Le Duan, who had succeeded Ho Chi Minh as party leader in 1960, believed that his military had broken the back of ARVN in Laos. Vietnamization, it seemed, had been a failure. The time had come for decisive action. What followed was the return of Le Duan's general offensive, general uprising strategy, which Hanoi had intermittently employed since 1965. Go-Gu was a two-pronged effort. The general offensive phase would see the NVA engage and destroy large enemy formations in conventional set-piece battles, gobbling up territory and bringing maximum pressure to bear across a large battlefront. Such dramatic victories, coupled with political efforts behind enemy lines, were designed to inspire South Vietnam's populace to rise up and help overthrow the South Saigon government. With its, quote, puppet regime vanquished, the United States would have little choice but to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from South Vietnam. Le Duan and Hanoi had dramatically employed Go-Gu during the 1968 Tet Offensive and its follow-on waves. Le Duan and his acolytes were now ready to give it another go. The decision was only reinforced following Nixon's China visit from 21 to 28 February. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai traveled to Hanoi on 3 March to reaffirm China's commitment to North Vietnam while also warning the VWP Politburo to abandon Go-Gu and instead negotiate a diplomatic end to the war. If North Vietnam pursued a military victory, Zhou said, the American president would surely, quote, punish it. Le Duan was incensed, accusing the PRC of rescuing Nixon from the failures of Vietnamization and Lam Song 719 abroad and his political vulnerability at home. Indeed, party leadership planned to use the electoral calendar against Nixon in an election year, while also leveraging congressional and domestic anti-war sentiment to blunt the president's response. When push came to shove, the Politburo believed, the Soviets and PRC would rally to their socialist ally, offering a strong rebuke if Nixon's reprisals dared strike above the 20th parallel. Ignoring Zhou, Le Duan gave the final go-ahead for the 1972 Nguyen Hue offensive, as North Vietnam's Central Military Commission assembled the military, logistical, and political assets for what would become known in the West as the Easter Offensive. Peace in Vietnam would have to wait. The dogs of all-out war would soon slip their bonds once more. The North Vietnamese had begun prioritizing a military rather than diplomatic solution well before Nixon's China trip. In the wake of Lam Song 719, the Central Committee of the VWP Politburo in June 1971 approved the Nguyen Hue offensive, which honored the birth name of one of Vietnam's most storied military commanders, Emperor Quang Trung. The plan called for a massive three-pronged offensive across the DMZ and Laotian border into South Vietnam's northernmost Quang Tri province, another into the Central Highlands province of Kon Tum from communist sanctuaries in Laos and Cambodia, and a third from Cambodian base areas west of Tay Ninh and Binh Long provinces northwest of Saigon. Each theater commander would have 3 to 4 infantry divisions, along with armor, artillery, and supporting arms. When all was said and done, North Vietnam's invasion force stood at some 225,000 troops with hundreds of Soviet-made PT-76 and T-54-55 tanks, 122 millimeter rocket and 130 millimeter heavy artillery, along with a formidable mix of self-propelled ZSU-57 autocannons, SA-7s, and other anti-aircraft assets. Nguyen Hue would be the largest, most powerful military array ever assembled by North Vietnam. On 30 March, tens of thousands of NVA troops, supported by armor, artillery, and anti-aircraft assets, stormed across the border into I Corps' northern provinces of Quang Tri and Tua Tin. Heavy cloud cover hampered close air support as the outnumbered and outgunned ARVN defenders were crushed under the onslaught. By 2 May, all of Quang Tri province was in communist hands, with the beleaguered South Vietnamese remnants holding a precarious defensive pocket around the ancient imperial city of Hue, site of so much carnage and sacrifice during the 1968 Tet Offensive. Meanwhile, on 2 April, a multi-divisional NVA force rolled across the frontier at Tay Ninh and Binh Long provinces in 3 Corps, gobbling up ARVN outposts along the way. Just days later, the district capital of Loc Ninh was in communist hands, with some 3 NVA divisions pushing to deliver the knockout blow to the provincial capital of An Loc, just 50 miles north of South Saigon. Aided by ferocious close air support and his American Regional Assistance Command advisors, 5th ARVN Division Commander Brigadier General Lee Von Hung held the line. The fight was far from over. By 23 April, the siege of An Loc was on. Some 300 miles northeast in the Central Highlands province of Kon the NVA's 320th Division, under Major General Huang Min Tao, launched the offensive's third prong on 12 April. Just 2 weeks later, the NVA had gobbled up most of western Kon province and was moving to seize the vital provincial capital of Kon City. The opening weeks of Nguyen Hue had seen remarkable success on all three battlefronts. South Vietnam was in trouble. MACV Commander General Crichton Abrams warned his superiors in Washington that the situation was dire, especially in the north, where the communists were once more poised to overrun Hue City. Worse, South Vietnamese military leadership was nearing its breaking point. If ARVN units lost their will to fight, Saigon's government might very well collapse. Meanwhile, Washington's calls for a diplomatic solution fell on deaf ears. On 2 May, Kissinger and Lê Duc met in Paris for the first time in 8 months. Nixon's national security advisor lambasted Tho for his country's egregious violation of the spirit of peace negotiations. The old revolutionary was unmoved. Kissinger later reported that Tho's intransigence, quote, suggested that the recent military successes had stiffened Hanoi's resolve to win the war on the battlefield. There would be no discussion of ceasefire, Tho concluded, because, quote, the prospects for the North Vietnamese were looking good. After 3 hours, a frustrated Kissinger ended the discussions, with neither side requesting a future meeting. Nixon was incensed. But his policy of U.S. withdrawal while pursuing Vietnamization left him few options. But the president still had one card to play: air power. Since the start of the offensive, air commanders had been gradually surging strike aircraft back into theater. Nixon ordered those efforts redoubled. By late May, hundreds of additional strike aircraft, along with the aerial transport and refueling assets, had swollen Air Force bases in Thailand and carrier group decks in the Tonkin Gulf. Included in this array were some 200 B-52 Stratofortresses, some based in Thailand, but most at Guam's Andersen Air Force Base. This represented approximately half of the Strategic Air Command's inventory. Nixon tasked Joint Chiefs Chair Admiral Thomas Moore with drawing up a comprehensive air campaign to achieve 3 objectives: crush the Easter Offensive, cripple the North's ability to wage war by destroying its industrial heartland, and bring Hanoi back to the bargaining table. A noted football enthusiast, the president had codenamed himself Quarterback during Kissinger's secret peace negotiations in Paris. It was perhaps fitting then that the new bombing campaign, set to begin on 10 May, be dubbed Operation Linebacker. For airstrike planning, North Vietnam had long been divided into 7 regions known as route packages. The 7th Air Force was responsible for all targets from the DMZ up to the 18th parallel, Route Package 1, along with RPs 5 and 6A encompassing northwest and north-central Vietnam, including Hanoi. Task Force 77 was charged with targeting Haiphong and the rest of North Vietnam's central and coastal regions, designated RPs 2, 3, 4, and 6B. Nixon summed up his resolve. Quote, "We have the power to destroy his war-making capacity," he said. "The only question is whether we have the will to use that power. What distinguishes me from Johnson is that I have the will in spades. Bastards have never been bombed like they're going to be bombed this time." But the task would be daunting. Since the end of the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign in November 1968, North Vietnam had continued a massive buildup of anti-aircraft assets. Thousands of communist bloc-supplied anti-aircraft weapons, including the Soviets' vaunted SA-2 surface-to-air missile, along with sophisticated radar to guide them, awaited American pilots. Indeed, by May 1972, Hanoi was second only to Moscow as the world's most heavily defended city against air attack. The North also boasted a fleet of some 200 Soviet MiG fighters, including the top-line MiG-21 Fishbed. Nevertheless, Nixon intoned, quote, "We have crossed the Rubicon." The time for massive response had arrived. The president announced his decision via nationally televised address on 8 May. In light of North Vietnam's full-scale invasion of the South, along with Hanoi's refusal to discuss a ceasefire and resume good faith peace negotiations, his administration was prepared to, quote, do whatever is required to safeguard American lives and American honor. The president vowed to dramatically escalate the air war above the 17th parallel. Further, and in accordance with intelligence indicating that some 85% of Hanой's imports and nearly all of its Soviet-supplied oil and sophisticated military equipment arrived by sea. Nixon announced that for the first time, the U.S. would mine Haiphong Harbor and other North Vietnamese ports. Dubbed Operation Pocket Money, the idea was not new. Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, SINCPAC from 1964 until his retirement in 1968, had advocated mining the ports, later lamenting that, quote, of all things we should have done but did not do, the most important was to neutralize Haiphong. Over the next 5.5 months, U.S. strike and strategic bombers would devastate NVA troop formations in the South, while wreaking destruction on nearly every aspect of the communist military, industrial, and economic infrastructure in the North. U.S. aircraft would fly nearly 42,000 sorties, unloading more than 155,000 tons of ordnance. That pounding, along with months of hard, bloody fighting by ARVN forces, would finally turn back Nguyen Way, breaking the sieges of Kon Tum and An Loc on 30 May and 12 June, respectively. By 16 September, Quang Tri City was back in South Vietnamese hands, with most of the remaining province reclaimed by the end of October. Hanoi's invasion had been soundly defeated. General Secretary Le Duan had banked on a stunning military victory that would annihilate South Vietnam's armed forces, expose Vietnamization as a failure, and push the United States out on terms dictated by Hanoi. What he got was the destruction of the North's best divisions, as some 100,000 troops fell dead and wounded, while hundreds of tanks, artillery, and anti-aircraft weapons were left wrecked and smoldering. Le Duan and his advisors had clearly underestimated what air power could do to such a mechanized force. Nguyen Way's mass troop formations and the extensive logistical and communication networks needed to support them proved ripe targets for U.S. and RVN air crews. It would take more than 2 years for the North's armed forces to recover. Moreover, Nixon's air war had exacted a monstrous toll on the North's industrial heartland. It had not only stymied the nearly 2-decade effort to conquer the South, but it severely retarded the progress of socialism. Since 1965, North Vietnam's population had grown by more than 4 million, but in the wake of Operation Linebacker, the country's gross national product had been knocked back to the early 1960s. The longer the U.S. air campaign raged, the worse the North's economic and military prospects. Also lurking was the possibility that much improved relations between the U.S. and Hanoi's Soviet and Chinese patrons might mean a reduction or even cutoff of foreign aid. From Hanoi's newfound perspective, the sooner a peace settlement could be reached, the better. Le Duan declared that it was time to refocus on the bargaining table, not battlefield, to win the day. He authorized Tho to resume his secret negotiations with the Americans beginning 19 July. Quote, we must concentrate our efforts on our first objective, the General Secretary said, forcing the Americans to withdraw. Once the United States left, final victory over its puppet regime in the South was only a matter of time. But the struggle had cost the Allies dearly as well. Some 99 U.S. aircraft had been shot down, including 45 Air Force, 44 Navy, and 10 Marine aircraft. More than 6% of Air Force losses resulted from MiG engagements, while the Navy and Marines lost roughly the same percentage to ground fire. SA-2 missiles would claim 24 U.S. aircraft. Finally, scores of U.S. airmen had been killed during the air campaign, and another 70 taken prisoner. RVN figures listed 43,000 casualties and hundreds of armored vehicles and artillery destroyed or captured. Moreover, NVA forces remained firmly in control of the border areas near the Ho Chi Minh Trail. ARVN, exhausted and depleted, was simply too spent to push them out. In all, South Vietnam would lose about 10% of its territory to the invasion. The loss would pose grave consequences for the Republic's survival in coming years. Still, though battered and bruised, South Vietnam's armed forces had taken the worst the communists could dish out. Without doubt, prodigious U.S. close air support, naval bombardment, and airlift capabilities and the American Forward Air Controllers and Regional Assistance Command Advisors, who coordinated it all, played an invaluable role. But the South's continuing dependence on U.S. military assistance did not bode well for its ability to stand alone. Although formal peace negotiations had resumed on 13 July, the real work of hammering out a settlement did not truly begin until Kissinger in late October renewed their secret meetings 6 days later. Gathering in a private home in a Paris suburb, each began by reiterating long-standing positions, albeit with minor variations. These included ceasefire conditions, the exchange of POWs, the post-war political complexion of Saigon, and so on. But when it came to the presence of North Vietnamese forces in the South, it was Kissinger who blinked first. Without consulting RVN President Nguyen Van Thu, the Nixon administration was now offering to pull all U.S. military assets from Indochina without requiring a commensurate withdrawal of NVA troops from South Vietnam. It was a stunning concession, especially in light of the Allies' vastly improved military situation since defeating Nguyen Hue and pummeling the North's industrial heartland. Indeed, such punishment had been the Politburo's principal reason for resuming negotiations in the first place. But now, accepting the presence of NVA troops in the South had become official U.S. policy. The administration's about-face would haunt the peace talks and Thu's reaction to them for the duration. Kissinger and Thieu worked quickly to finalize the deal. By 17 October, the men had verbally assented to the final draft, the, quote, agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. Now, all that remained was to gain Thu's acceptance. After all, although Kissinger had cut the North-South Vietnamese president out of the secret negotiations, Nixon's honorable peace demanded that Thieu be a willing partner. Kissinger arrived in Saigon on 19 October and presented the agreement as a fait accompli. Thieu was outraged that the Americans had negotiated a deal with his bitter enemies behind his back. Chief among his many complaints was that the agreement did not require the North to remove its troops from South Vietnam, did not recognize the DMZ as a legitimate political boundary between two sovereign states, and placed the NLF and PRG on an equal footing as the Saigon government. All this and more, Thieu exclaimed, undermined the very essence of what the U.S. and South Vietnam had fought and sacrificed to achieve. To accept such an agreement, Thieu said, would not only threaten his country's survival, but would undermine his credibility as a national leader. Hanoi, he continued, quote, had always accused us of being America's puppet. Now Kissinger was treating us like one. Thieu insisted that Kissinger go back to the communists and wring further concessions that he believed would ensure his nation's survival. But Hanoi refused, instead demanding the Americans honor their verbal commitment and sign the October draft. Over the ensuing weeks, the talks ground to a halt. Kissinger and the Americans continued to press for Thieu's changes, while Thieu and Hanoi withdrew a number of their own concessions. The communists soon reverted to their time-worn and frustrating negotiating tactics that had made the previous 4 years of peace talks such a misery. Kissinger, his exhaustion and frustration evident, summarized his experiences during the 13 December session. It appeared, he wrote, that, quote, Hanoi has decided to play for time. Their consistent pattern is to give us just enough each day to keep us going, but nothing decisive which could conclude an agreement. They wish to ensure that we have no solid pretext for taking tough actions. They keep matters low-key to prevent a resumption of bombing. They could have settled in 3 hours any time these past 3 days if they wanted to, but they have deliberately avoided this. Instead, for every one of their supposed, quote, semi-concessions, he continued, they introduced a counter-demand, or agreed only to move objectionable sentences and provisions from one part of the text to another, instead of simply deleting as requested. The delegations broke off talks after the session, but agreed to continue exchanging diplomatic notes via cable. Nixon, facing his own set of daunting political constraints, knew time was running out. Although he had been re-elected in a landslide that November, his success did not translate to the rest of his party. Democrats held dominant majorities in both houses, and the incoming 93rd Congress promised to be even more hostile to the war than the 92nd. In 1972 alone, legislators had introduced 35 resolutions to limit or end American involvement in Vietnam. If no settlement was in place by the new year, Nixon was convinced Congress was very likely simply cut off funding for the war, dooming South Vietnam and his pledge of an honorable peace. To break the gridlock, momentum built for a new, all-out campaign to unleash unprecedented fury upon the North Vietnamese heartland. Nixon directed JCS Chairman Admiral Thomas Moore to work up a comprehensive plan for hitting strategic and military targets above the 20th parallel, with a concentration on the Haiphong-Hanoi complex. He also ordered North Vietnam's harbors and ports be remined. Addressing his commanders, the president did not mince words. Quote, "I don't want any more of this crap about the fact that we couldn't hit this target or that one," he thundered. "This is your chance to use military power to win this war, and if you don't, I'll hold you responsible." On 15 December, Nixon directed Colonel George Guay, the military attaché in Paris, to present Hanoi with an ultimatum: accept the 23 November draft as the basis for resumed peace talks on 26 December, or U.S. air power will once again train its sights on North Vietnam. If the president received no answer within 72 hours, Hanoi would bear the responsibility. When none was forthcoming, the die was cast. Planners dubbed the new effort Operation Linebacker 2, the so-called Christmas bombings to its critics. Designed as an around-the-clock operation, the new campaign called for massed B-52 night attacks, along with highly selective F-111 and A-6 raids on airfields, communication hubs, and air defense sites. Meanwhile, hundreds of 7th Air Force and Task Force 77 tactical fighter bombers were to pound targets during the day. Beginning on 18 December, Linebacker 2 unleashed 11 days and nights of unprecedented destruction on military and industrial targets in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. By campaign's end on 29 December, 200 B-52s out of Utapao and Anderson had flown 729 bombing sorties into the teeth of North Vietnam's vaunted air defenses, delivering more than 15,000 tons of bombs on 34 targets. Estimates vary, but ground crews reportedly fired between 800 and 1,200 SA-2 missiles in response, downing 15 stratofortresses. Despite the seemingly jarring numbers, however, this constituted just a 2.06% loss rate, well short of the 3 to 5% expected by planners. Another 10 B-52s were damaged, 3 severely. 33 SAC aviators were killed or missing, and another 33 made POWs. Of the 31 buff airmen to reach Laotian or Thai airspace, 24 were rescued. Meanwhile, Air Force, Navy, and Marine air crews flew more than 1,200 strike and support sorties. Tactical strike bombers added another 5,000 tons of ordnance to the tally, while escort and combat air patrol fighters downed 4 MiGs. B-52 tail gunners would claim a pair of MiG-21s as well. In return, the North Vietnamese mustered MiGs, launched SAMs, and raked the skies with an untold number of anti-aircraft rounds to ward off the attackers. The Air Force lost 5 aircraft, while hostile fire claimed another 6 Navy and Marine planes. In all, the strike and support effort cost the U.S. 10 airmen killed and 8 taken prisoner. Another 11 were rescued. Still, North Vietnam's vaunted air defenses had been shattered. 6 months, naval blockade, overland interdiction, and relentless air attack had depleted or destroyed its SA-2 stocks, while what remained of its once potent fighter inventory had been gutted. At long last, North Vietnam was at the full mercy of American air power. The rest of the country had suffered mightily as well, its economic, military, industrial, and transportation infrastructure in ruins. Nearly every aspect of the economy had been wrecked, from the production of coal, electricity, and fertilizer to machine tools, textiles, and more. During the 11 days of Linebacker 2, some 1,600 military structures had been damaged or destroyed, rail transport substantially cut at 500 separate locations, nearly 400 cars of rolling stock eliminated, a quarter of the country's POL stocks wiped out, and nearly every airfield above the 20th parallel wrecked. Approximately 80% of electrical capacity destroyed, and untold numbers of stockpiles, repair, and maintenance facilities battered. Moreover, material imports, which had crept back up during Nixon's 8-week bombing pause, once again plummeted from their pre-Linebacker levels of 160,000 tons per month to just 30,000 tons by January. Hanoi was once again ready to talk. Kissinger and Tow reconvened in Paris on 8 January. Working quickly, the two had the final agreement hammered out by 13 January. The settlement was nearly identical to the October draft. Most troublesome, it did not require the North to remove its troops from RVN territory. Instead, the two sides were to negotiate troop levels and positioning between themselves. Kissinger and Tow agreed to initial the agreement in Paris on 23 January, with the official signing 4 days later. Again, the task now became gaining Tow's acceptance. Writing a series of personal letters to the RVN president, Nixon pledged to both respond massively if the North violated the agreement and to continue generous military and economic aid to Saigon after the war. But the president also warned that should Tow not take this final offer, it was almost certain that Congress would cut off funding for both. With a thinly veiled threat of complete abandonment by the U.S. looming, Tow had no choice but to relent. On a cold and dreary Paris morning on 27 January, delegations from the U.S., South and North Vietnam, and the PRG gathered in the ornate ballroom of the Hotel Majestic to sign the agreement to restore peace and end the war in Vietnam. Tow had very little faith that it would do either, for he understood that no peace agreement would stand in the way of Hanoi's years-long fight to unify the Vietnams under communist rule. Instead, this accord has simply ushered in a new phase of the war. Forced to sign an agreement he abhorred, the South Vietnamese president could only hope that Nixon would honor his pledge to continue U.S. support and retaliate when Hanoi inevitably violated the agreement. On 29 March 1973, the last U.S. military assets withdrew from Vietnam, never to return. For neither Congress, the American public, nor Nixon himself had the stomach for more conflict in Indochina. That summer, Nixon's longtime fears of a congressional cutoff of war funding were finally realized when on 1 July, legislators passed an appropriations bill forbidding use of funds for military action in Vietnam. Later that year, Congress overwhelmingly passed the War Powers Resolution, overriding Nixon's veto in the process. The act required the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of U.S. troops engaging in foreign combat to place a 60-day limit on any operation without further congressional authorization. There would be no massive reaction to North Vietnamese violations. Over the next 2 years, Congress continued to slash foreign aid to South Vietnam. Nixon, resigned in the wake of the Watergate scandal, could only watch from the sidelines as his pledges to went unfulfilled. On the heels of yet another massive conventional invasion in early 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon on 30 April. Hanoi had at last realized its decades-long dream of unifying the Vietnams under its rule. All right, folks, that is the end of the presentation portion.
Hey, Keith, that was great. Thank you so much. I'm going to start by asking a question. What was the inspiration for this book? And before I let you answer that, I'm sure you've got some familiarity with the Army Navy Club, but we're primarily a group of active, retired, and reserve military. We also have a lot of civilians as well. To include some of the people listening are, in fact, Vietnam vets. So before I open up to the question, the demographics that you'll be dealing with is people who love history. So with that, what was your inspiration is my first question. And then I'm going to go to Q&A and I'm going to start taking a look at answering those one at a time.
The inspiration is the anniversary last year of the end of the war, the fall of Saigon, so to speak. So, I that didn't happen in a vacuum. And so my inspiration for this was to look at that preceding year. You could look at the entire war, all of the ebbs and flows that occurred. Obviously, every bit of it had something to do with what ended up happening on 30 April 75. But that last year, 72, was what really, those were the major nails in the coffin, if you will. A lot of duplicity, a lot of political constraints and all the rest. In the end of the day, to me, as not of the Vietnam generation, I was the generation that came with the first generation after Vietnam. I always looked at this situation as a great tragedy and as an effort, a supreme effort was made, and then the way that it was ended, it's always rubbed me the wrong way, and that's really just what I wanted to do. I wanted to look at that final year, look at some of the decisions that were made, and sort of, I've always asked myself why, and this book is part of the process.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. First question, Steve Cloak wants to know how much of the contribution to Nixon and Kissinger's work would you attribute to prevailing war fatigue?
Uh, by work, you meaning their decisions in that year?
Yeah.
Did I hear that correctly? Okay. Oh, most definitely. There were major constraints at this point. The anti-war movement was always sort of threatening to boil over. It had sort of settled down as a little bit anyway, as Nixon had scaled the draft down to nothing, and especially as he pulled combat formations out of Vietnam, that was his way of sort of diffusing the situation. And I think that definitely had something to do with it. From Kissinger's perspective, I mean, he had a boss, and the boss wanted the United States out of Vietnam, but at the same time, he did want I think Nixon was a little bit more interested in preserving South Vietnam than Kissinger. I think Kissinger was ready. There's a quote that I found that I did not include in this presentation, where Kissinger was essentially trying to convince Nixon that in a year and a half, no one's going to care. And so let's just get out, And so in Nixon, ever the realist, but at the same time, he was, so he was going to be somewhat open to that line of thinking, but he pushed back on that and really did not, really regretted thinking about just abandoning South Vietnam to its fate, especially after so much blood and treasure had been sacrificed. And that's really what Tu was trying to say too. And I understand, just in South Korea was the same way. You had corrupt leadership. Eventually, they came around. Eventually, you think that probably South Vietnam's leadership would have come around and become more. It was a republic. It had a constitution. There were, obviously, there was a lot of corruption, a lot of political problems. But you think he was still a nationalist. He was trying to say, look, this is what we've been fighting for this whole time. If you do this, if you allow these troops to stay in our country, if you continue to let Hanoi not respect the fact that we have that we are a legitimate political entity that's separate from them, and we have borders and we have sovereignty and so forth, then that undermines everything that we've worked for. That's everything that we've fought and sacrificed for. And so I think that both Kissinger and Nixon were definitely working under some serious political constraints. We saw that the Congress in '73 eventually did cut off funding. I think if the war would have kept going, they would have done that. And so I think Nixon, he was pretty politically astute, right? He knew that was coming. I just think that, I don't know. Once you're out, you're going back in, or you're going to make more POWs, right? Once all the troops leave and all the air assets leave, are you really going to go back in there and respond massively? And you got to figure that he had to know, at least in some part of them, that was it. Once we were out, that was it.
I've got three questions in the queue, but you talked about POWs. One of the questions we have is actually from somebody who was a POW for most of the war. And he wants to know, how do you feel about the U.S. action to separate South Vietnam from North Vietnam after the peace agreements of 1954? It seems like the U.S. sabotaged these agreements because almost certainly Ho Chi Minh would have won the election.
Most definitely. He was very popular, inspirational figure. I believe that the North had a larger population at that time. I would say that, you think back, a lot of this could have been avoided, right? But at the same time, we're dealing with something that was, what is that, 70 years now, or in that territory. And things were different, perspectives were different. You're in the height of the Cold War. Obviously, the U.S. got involved in Indochina in the first place because it was trying to prop up its French ally who had taken such a beating in World War II, needed to get it strong. France had a pretty predominant communist party that they, could have taken over if things, went terribly wrong. So the U.S. thought it was in their interest to help them, and then when they got defeated, it was sort of like, and we all know about the domino theory and all the rest. The U.S. and Saigon, South Vietnam, did not sign the 54 accords. That was the French and the Viet Minh, and they never agreed to that. The provisions. It is just sort of understood that there should have been elections in 56. And in that case, yes, I would most definitely say Ho Chi Minh would have won. And the rest, as they say, is history. Who knows how it would have gone after that?
Okay, I've got 3 questions in the queue. Let's go with what's your assessment from the South Vietnamese military's ability to defend the South in 1975 if the U.S. continued to provide logistics support but not air power?
Logistics was a big thing. Another thing that I've got a section obviously on this that you just can't cover but there were the cutoff, the congressional slashing of aid to South Vietnam was dramatic and it was telling, but it wasn't the only story. There was a certain amount of corruption where funds were being funneled off to South Vietnamese officers and so forth. We all know about that aspect. There was also the Arab oil shock, which really ended up doing a real number not only on our economy here. As a little kid, I think I can remember those gas lines and stuff like that. And it was rough, but for us, waiting in line was one thing, but South Vietnam took a big beating, a hellacious beating economically. And so by early 1972, ARVN soldiers were allotted something like 30 rounds for their rifles a month. All like surveillance aircraft could not fly for most days. So all of this, meanwhile, they're getting ready for what was ended up being Campaign 275, which was supposed to take 2 years. And because they were able to, ARVN folded so quickly and mass chaos happened that they were able to do it in one, and they changed the name to the Ho Chi Minh campaign in that year. So all this force is building up on the borders. South Vietnam couldn't even surveil it because of the lack of spotter aircraft, because being grounded for parts were missing. Aircraft was air fuel was heavily rationed and so forth. So all of these economic things had a mass effect. Couple that, but then there was a psychological effect. And that is the U.S. has abandoned us. And they were afraid of that for years anyway. But it really, really broke. Not having those regional, those advisors alongside them, and then finally seeing funds cut off. And the U.S., in this case, President Ford, really is just sort of saying, the war's over for us as far as we're concerned, when the first shots of that 1975 invasion happened. And no retaliation was coming. And then they started, morale really plummeted. Tu made a couple of egregious mistakes when it came to, he tried to essentially just abandon the northern part of the country in the middle of a general offensive, having his what troops he had, trying to have them redeploy down to the southern area, right? It was a strategy called light on top, heavy at the bottom, right? He was going to sacrifice the northern provinces and just defend the populous, wealthy areas along the coast and try to hold out there. You can shift troops around during relative peace, but not during a general offensive when you're being pressed on, 3 or 4 fronts. So that was disastrous. That led into it, right? I think the material shortages and the morale shattering that was caused by the U.S. abandoning them, I think really sort of kicked things off in a negative way. another thing to remember too, besides those material shortages, South Vietnam was always on the defensive. And so they were trying to defend everywhere. And so they were strong nowhere. And so, the North, meanwhile, could mass and attack and always enjoyed uh, uh, numerical and material superiority at the tactical level. So they could attack the places of their choosing. Meanwhile, South Vietnam had their forces spread everywhere and they were really strong nowhere. So all of these things went into effect. I think could um, logistical support and aid have helped them as long as it had kept up. I think by the time we got to 75, I think that Ford tried to get like a $700 million package in like a week or two before Saigon fell. I mean, what would that have done? If they had kept up and they had kept their promises, um, then maybe they could have bolstered them, kept them, bolstered up, kept, helped them with surveillance, satellite imagery, anything like that, intelligence. But really, once the POWs came home, America was done with Vietnam. And that would include the Congress, that included the public, and certainly the president. And so, I mean, it's, you're abandoning an ally in that respect, but it's complicated, as we all know.
Okay, Keith, for the next one, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Did the U.S. end to Vietnam conflict show a lack of resolve that may have empowered future challenges to the U.S.? And along that same lines, it's now popular to say the U.S. lost the war. How do you feel about that conclusion?
Okay, so two of them. Did it foster future challenges? I would think so. I think that um, the Viet Cong gave provided a blueprint, right, for fighting a stronger power. But in the end, we also have to remember that in Tet 68, the Viet Cong ceased to exist almost, right? I mean, they were devastated in that offensive, which Ho was not in favor of, but he was by this time a year from his death, and he was, Lê Duan had taken over. Um, but so it was a conventional victory in Vietnam. Those were tanks and artillery and combined arms that were rolling across those frontiers from 72 on. And it wasn't guys in black pajamas or whatever. Now the guys in black pajamas probably helped wear out the US, which is what they said they were going to do. But it was the conventional arms that won that fight. But yes, I think it definitely fostered future challenges. Did the U.S. lose the war? I'm just going to take that at face value, and say yes, right? Because we did not accomplish the goal that we set out to accomplish, which was a free and stable South Vietnamese republic. And so we, sort of abandoned them and left them to their fate. Again, after a lot of sacrifice on the United States' part, so that's again just taking that at the face value. That's what it would be. But we certainly had a lot of help in losing it as well.
Okay, it looks like I got one more in the queue. So if there's any other questions, we're not constrained by time if there's any good questions to follow up. But this question that I currently have, one of the listeners wants to know, with your research as it relates to the North Vietnamese, how open and honest were you, or were you more biased towards the South Vietnamese?
You mean did I take the South side more than the North? Is that essentially what we're
I
saying?
think that's what they're implying.
Okay. I mean, everything's perspective. I mean, one thing is that I don't read Vietnamese. So, Mel Pribenow, who is, a legend in this field, is an old CIA hand who translated a lot of things, and thank God for him. But, if you can't read it yourself, it's kind of hard. You're looking for translations. The way I looked at it is that on the one hand, you could see the perspective. You could see the perspective of the North. We want a unified country. We want to be communists. That's what we want. We want to have our own country. We want to have all foreign invaders out. We don't want any puppets of foreign invaders, as they would say. You can understand that. You can sympathize with that. Um, the the fact was is that there was a lot of duplicity. There was a lot of in my opinion, a lot of methods that were used early on from the Viet Cong all the way to the very end that were just, I mean, humanity wise, I mean, it was pretty rough. I mean, people, there'd be, talked about cords earlier. They'd go in and, inoculate kids in villages, and the Viet Cong would come in there and sometimes chop their arms off where they got the shot to prevent, we all know these stories, and they're well founded. So yes, I mean, I guess, I mean, I'm an American. I see things from the perspective of my country, but also from the fact that my country made promises, didn't keep them, not only to a foreign government that was our ally, but also to our own guys who, we sent over and said, do these things. And then they did those things, and then they're treated very poorly from all levels, and they don't get their parades and all the rest. So, but yes, I see things. So I don't know if you would call me biased. I worked with the information that I had, but yes, I mean, you got to say that I probably look at things more from an American perspective and American military perspective rather than from the North's. Although I can certainly sympathize with their desires.
Okay, and it looks like the question I just got clarification from the person who asked. Question was, how open are the North Vietnamese to do research?
Okay. Some of the archives have opened. They, the thing is that they publish a lot of official, party histories and things like that. And it has a certain language, and it has a certain way of conveying things, and some of it just doesn't even comport with reality. And so you got to say, you also have, it's always in the back of your mind that there's a concerted party line that is constantly being, supported. Even, and it's just a different thing when I have looked at the primary sources from Vietnamese source, North Vietnamese sources, they even lie to themselves, in a way, sort of to turn it on its head, like in a way that some American commanders lied about body counts, right? This is how you advance or whatever. You need to kill X number of people, and if you can't count them, literally, then you just write a number down that you think is there. Uh, that's a small example, though. We're talking about just wholesale. You really have to learn to read between the lines to kind of balance out what North Vietnamese sources were saying. And again, they not only are trying to present a face to the world, but they're legitimately uncomfortable about speaking the truth. So you hear things like when they would suffer a tactical defeat, let's say, instead of just sort of laying it out and how it happened, it's like, you hear phrases like they were not sufficiently, motivated or things like that. Um, they were, insufficiently committed to the revolutionary cause. And you know what I'm saying? And so then you read between the lines like, all right, somebody messed up, and it happens. But that's not what they're going to tell you. They're going to tell you that, there wasn't enough zeal there, or there wasn't enough self-sacrifice or something like that. So it really is interesting seeing those sources. Again, these have been translated into English, but, so again, I don't read the original Vietnamese, but they're translated in English from reasonably, like I mentioned, Merle and so forth. And you have to read between the lines to figure out, what really happened rather than what the party line is. And so I guess they're open about letting you see certain things. It's not like the Venona decrypts that we got in the late 90s when the Soviet Union really started to open up. Or, at that time it had dissolved. But I mean, you really got in and saw a lot of the original stuff there, and realized all the things that they were doing over these years that people were accusing them of doing. They actually were doing them, but we only found out after the fact. But those archives were pretty open about things, and I think that Vietnam is still run by the Communist Party, and so they're only going to put out a certain line. I guess that's my view on that.
Okay. Going back to the North Vietnamese fighters, perhaps why do you think the North Vietnamese fought with more dedication or effectiveness than the soldiers to the South? I think you've kind of hinted at that, but would you like to elaborate at all?
Yeah, I think it was probably two-pronged, right? There was let's throw a third prong in there as well. So on the one hand, you probably had a certain percentage of soldiers. Remember, these guys are traveling down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to come and fight in the South. And so that's an arduous journey, especially in the early days. I mean, they're starving, they're sick. They had to forage for food on the way down there. Only toward the latter part of the war did the trail really develop, especially during Johnson's 4-year bombing pause, at least to the north. So, there was a certain percentage probably that believed in what they were doing. I think there was a larger percentage that it's a different situation. If your first sergeant is not happy with you in the American Army, then you're going to get maybe you'll get an Article 15 or something like that at worst, or you'll get shit duty or something like that. But I mean, if the North Vietnamese are unhappy with you, if your commanders are unhappy with you, that could be the end of you. And you're already suffering. You're a long way from home. What are you going to do? You're going to get out there and you just gotta do it. So I think there's a certain percentage of that. I think the third prong I wanted to add in too is going back to the North Vietnamese, records. It was everything that we conducted. Yes, there was certainly lies and duplicity and all the rest of it. I mean, I don't know how you wage a war without those sort of things. Not that I'm endorsing it, but on our side, but it was still a largely an open book. The media roamed the country at will. They could get on any helicopter, go to any fight that they wanted. Some of the later things like pool reporting in the Gulf War and embeds during Iraq and Afghanistan they didn't have that kind of freedom. So you saw things and you heard things and you got reports of things. I think that a lot of what went on behind the scenes in North Vietnam and their army just never was reported. You're starting to see some things trickling out now where there was, again, reading between the lines on some of those communist sources when someone is not sufficiently zealous to the revolutionary cause or something like that, that might indicate somebody's unhappy with being there and indicate that someone doesn't want to be there fighting, but they don't have any choice. In my first book, The Siege of Play Me, they discovered gunners. Everyone was incredibly surprised by the fact that these anti-aircraft gunners were just doing battle with close air support. And then they find them later on after the battle that they've been chained to the guns. They can't run away if they wanted to. And so I'm not saying everyone was like that. I'm saying those things happened. And so you have to say there's probably a solid percentage of the people that came south that probably didn't want to be there but they really had no choice for various reasons. So some believed. I think probably a much larger percentage was just there because they had to be. And they really had no choice. There was nothing, there was nowhere to go.
Okay, I've got
Other than
two
forward.
more questions, and then I'm going to give it back to you for wrapping up. One of the questions is sort of a corollary. One of our members spent some time in Moscow and said the people there largely couldn't care about politics. And the question is, the Vietnamese are largely rural folk. Do they have evidence of the same thing, that politics really wasn't a concern to those in the rural populations?
I think that that's why they had political cadres. right? Every unit had to have political cadres, not only to sort of proselytize to the rural population, but also to keep their own guys in place. Another thing I didn't mention in this, but Lezuan ordered a full sort of revolutionary education initiative prior to the 72 invasion. He wanted those political cadres to go into the units and explain, right, in as we would think, why they're doing it, what the whole purposes of this thing is, and so forth, to get them sufficiently ginned up politically so that they would be on board with the sacrifices that were going to come. You know, you had to know, they had to know that they were going to take a horrendous beating. Apparently, they didn't know well enough because they still launched it. Um, but, you know, I think that they expected a response. It was far more ferocious than what they probably in their worst nightmare. But they knew something bad was going to happen to them if they launched this invasion. And so they had to get all these guys on board. So the, you know, I think the rank and file, no, I think that the people in the villages, you know, if they're people like anybody else, they want to be left alone. They just want to be, you know, they don't want their arms chopped off. They don't want someone coming in and taking their stuff or making them, you know, making them feed the soldiers or whatever. I think that's the vast majority of it. So probably that's correct. I mean, just like most of us as Americans aren't, you know, overly concerned about politics. I mean, especially in a rural setting where you're just living, you know, you're just living day to day. You don't want to, you don't care, you know. But if someone's got a gun and they're there at night and there's no government forces around to protect you, then you're probably going to do what the guy with the gun says, you know. And you know, probably that's a lot of it there, I'd say.
Okay, last question is a follow up on the if you say we lost the war, would you also say that Ho might be turning over in his grave in what Vietnam has become today? So even though you talked about the mission of the war at the time, I think this is suggesting that over time, has that not changed, perhaps to be more favorable for us, and not so much to Ho Chi Minh?
Yeah, I mean, he was a committed communist. Yes, he was a nationalist, but he was also a committed communist and went to the Soviet Union early, you know, in the back to the 20s. I mean, it wasn't like, you know, he only came to communism after the US started. This is sort of a prevailing myth. However, yeah, he probably would look at, I mean, I think a lot of people think, especially when you don't have anything or you're trying to gain independence or something like that. We saw this in this, especially in the 60s with all the revolutionary movements. Uh, Communism seems great, right? Especially as opposed to maybe what you've been having. And so once you see it, live under it for, you know, a couple of decades, you start to realize, hey, maybe this isn't all that great. But then by that time, it's too late, right? So yes, I think maybe you know, sort of the wanting was a lot more appealing than the having. And so maybe he is. I mean, I can tell you this. I can tell you that he would not have wanted the 72 invasion. Um, he was much more of a mind of the slow, protracted wear the enemy out, and eventually they'll give up and leave. And he said that many times. And Lê Duan was the one who was always pushing these, you know, large conventional battles all the way back to 64 when he launched his first general offensive, general uprising campaign. He did that three times, 64, 65, 68 in Tet, and 72. And every single one of them was disastrous. Um, you know, probably a million, or at least 500,000 people killed on his side, you know, if you tally them all up. And Ho did not want those things. But he was marginalized by that time. So would he be turning over in grade? He probably, I think he would be happy that the revolution succeeded, that the Vietnams were united under communist rule. They expelled foreigners, and which is another thing they wanted to do. Again, these guys were nationalists. Um, but I mean, would he approve of what's going on today? Probably rolling around in his grave a little bit, because again, dreaming of these things and seeing socialism or communism as the way to get to them is one thing, but living under it, year after year is another.